Hello everybody, I'm Bill Cash, MP for Stone, and I've campaigned against EU political union in Parliament and for your democracy for 30 years. Tomorrow is a historic moment for all of us. I want to explain to you why I believe we must leave the European Union. At the very heart of this referendum debate is the very simple question, who governs you and how? People fought and died for this in 2 world wars. It is about your democracy and your right in general elections to choose the government and the laws by which you are governed, and everything else, including the running of the economy, ultimately depends on this democratic right. In the European Union, over 55% of your laws are made in Brussels, and they are imposed on you under what is called the European Communities Act 1972. It has not worked in your own or our national interest, as more and more powers and laws have been passed and handed over by successive British governments to the EU without your direct consent. What started out as a common market has now turned into an ever greater drive towards an undemocratic political union dominated by Germany. All over Europe there are protests and riots, massive unemployment, and the rise of the far right. I predicted all this in the early 1990s when I led the rebellion against the Maastricht Treaty signed by John Major, and I campaigned for a referendum for you then. Therefore, I hope you would be good enough to listen to what I'm going to say now, and I urge you to vote to leave tomorrow. We are directly affected by everything that happens in the Eurozone, as well as the EU, of which it is and we are part. They are driving further and faster towards a European superstate, and they have demanded that this will happen within a few years. When you vote tomorrow, therefore, you can be sure that this is what you will be voting for. If you vote to remain in, you will be voting to allow a further development along these lines. The euro is in crisis, with massive unemployment and protests and riots. It doesn't work, and most of the voters in the other member states are so disillusioned that they are calling for referendums in their own countries. In the meantime, European growth has been declining internationally year by year, and jobs are being lost. If we remain in the EU, we will be outvoted, as we already are over and over again, by a majority of other countries. This is how the system works. But as bad as this is, 55% of our laws are made in the EU, and they affect every aspect of your daily lives. These laws are generally decided behind closed doors by EU and other bureaucrats, and frequently are nodded through by ministers. We never win a vote. This is not what people fought and died for when we saved Europe in 2 world wars. And in the House of Commons, all legislation is passed in the open, with speeches which are recorded, with votes are recorded, and you know who has done what, and your members of Parliament are genuinely accountable to you. This is not the case in the EU at all. Indeed, Germany invariably gets its way, for example, opening its borders, and Angela Merkel's deal with Mr. Erdogan of Turkey only a few weeks ago. As to the single market, although many big companies and bankers want to remain in the European Union, overall the single market is not working for us. The House of Commons and the Office of National Statistics and the Library of the House of Commons itself tells us that our trade deficit in goods and services with the other 27 EU countries is a disastrous £68 billion a year. It has gone up, this deficit, by 9 billion in the last year alone. These figures come from the House of Commons Library and the Office of National Statistics. However, Germany's surplus in goods and services with the same 27 member states is 82 billion. A vast difference. And that has gone up by a massive 18 billion this last year alone. This tells you that the single market does not work for the UK, but it certainly does for Germany. By contrast, our trade surplus with the rest of the world is £31 billion a year, and this accelerated by 7 billion in the last year alone. That is the trajectory. That is what it would be like if we were out of the European Union, still trading with the European Union, but nonetheless trading on an accelerating and improving and prosperous way with the rest of the world. We are the 5th largest global economy, and the chief executive of the main German trade federation stated only today that they need to and will continue to vote with us. However, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, in the meantime threatens us with bad consequences if we leave the single market. If we do leave the single market, we will decide our own trade policy. The EU will not, and we will regain genuine influence, not a theoretical influence, but genuine and real influence, for example, in the World Trade Organization. And, of course, we will also regain control over our own trade policy. Outside the European Union, we will run our own trade, we will govern ourselves, and we will have a very positive and dynamic future ahead of us. You don't need to be in the EU to trade with the EU, which of course we will continue to do because they need our trade. And incidentally, the EU has failed to achieve trade deals with America, with China, with Japan, and a host of other countries. We can do this, as Switzerland has done, for example, in establishing a trade deal only last week with India. We will also get rid of unnecessary business overregulation, which inhibits our small businesses, and we will thereby generate more jobs and provide, through reasonable taxation, for better public services in this country, such as the National Health Service, schools and housing. We will also decide all our own immigration laws, which is a very, very important question. We will decide our own border controls and overcome the massive strain on our public services, which has come from the free movement imposed on us under these European treaties. We will also decide our own security and defence, which we should run through NATO and not with an EU army. Our need for our own security includes security against jihadist attacks such as we have witnessed in Brussels and Paris. These came from the collapse of the border system when Merkel opened their borders without proper legal authority. As to the Prime Minister's failed negotiations, he continues to mislead people over this. Even this morning on the Today programme, and indeed as he also said to the House of Commons on the 8th of June, he had secured, he said, treaty change from ever closer union. He has not. None of his negotiating package will be a guaranteed treaty change when you cast your vote tomorrow, nor is there any guarantee that it will ever happen. This is endorsed by the House of Commons Library and the European Scrutiny Committee, of which I'm chairman. Therefore, if you vote to remain, you are voting for the existing, failed, unreformed European Union as it is now. You are being cheated. You are being misled on a monumental scale by the Remain campaign and by the government, the Prime Minister, and by big businesses and bankers who have been scaremongering for the last few months. This dangerous situation, bad as it is, will get increasingly worse as the EU drives forward with their absolute determination to achieve political union within a few years. This is what you will be stuck with if you vote to remain. Our country will be reduced to the second tier of a two-tier German Europe. These are facts. This will affect us all directly. We are constantly outvoted, and because what will happen happens to the European Union as a whole, including the Eurozone. This undermines our national democracy and your right to govern yourselves. We cannot control, influence, or reform the European Union from within, and we never will. On your right to govern yourself and your democracy, everything else depends. For you, your children, your grandchildren, and future generations, I urge you to leave this European Union and to vote to do so tomorrow. It is unworkable, unreformable, dysfunctional, and undemocratic. Thank you very much for listening.